Well, greetings, everybody. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Our speaker tonight is Daniel Kaplan. And for those that don't know Daniel, he's been on a couple of times. And Daniel is passionate about how to make better, encourage righteous behavior in the world and the fight against misinformation in the Bible. He was lucky to be born into a commandment-keeping household and raised by scholarly Dr. Mark Kaplan. I'm sure those who are in worldwide background recognize that name well. He currently manages Flair Church, an online fellowship with innovative format that meets weekly on a Facebook video feed. So you can go to Facebook and search for Flair Church, and his services are quite unique and very interesting, and really a cool format. It's not your typical listen to someone yammer on and snooze. It has some very fast-paced and music, and the whole format is really cool. He may want to elaborate. Did you want to elaborate a little bit about that there, Daniel?
I might at the end, sure.
Or I don't know if you can bring it up. You can share on your computer, bring it up in your homepage for that.
Yeah, I mean, if you just do a search on Facebook, Flair, or if you just type www.facebook.com/Flair Church, you'll get it as well. And that's Flair spelled like a flare, like a signal flare, not like flare like with flare, although the double entendre is not unintentional.
So be sure to check that out on Facebook. And with that, you can introduce your topic, which you can see up there is hacking your brain for righteousness. So take it away, Daniel.
All right, yes, hacking your brain for righteousness. I picked a rather provocative title. There is a meme that goes around the internet that you maybe have seen, but I find very cute, and it's a summary of the Bible, and it says, Genesis, God, all right, you two, don't do one thing. Other than that, have fun. And then Adam and Eve says, okay. Satan says, you should do the thing. And Adam and Eve say, okay. And God said, what happened? And Adam and Eve said, we did the thing. And then it says, the rest of the Old Testament, God, you are my people, you should not do the things. People, we won't do the things. God, good. People, we did the things. And so on and so forth. And this pattern just repeats all the way to the end when you get to Revelation, where it says, when Jesus comes back, there will be no more people who do the things. In the meantime, stop doing the things. The end. It's actually a pretty good, basic summary of the Bible in a sense. I mean, we're all trying to become more righteousness. And let me actually switch now so you can see me, hopefully. Am I visible? Now I don't see me. Sorry about that.
Not you. You're supersized now.
I know. I'm in the luxurious Christian Commandment Keeper studios where my dad films his videos. No, but my point is that even though we all kind of know this basic summary of the Bible, we know what to do, we often fall short, And is there really a way to become more righteous, almost like a psychological shortcut? Is there a way to get past some of these human frailties that we have? So to get started, I'm going to have you kind of do an experiment. And in order to do this experiment, we're going to need to write something down, or you have to type something on your phone. But I'll give you a moment to put that together to figure out what it is you're going to use. And while you're getting that together, I'm going to say the Bible obviously has a lot to say about taking the effort of pursuit of righteousness. Obviously, in Matthew, Christ speaks of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are blessed, for they will be filled. And the greatest commandment includes to love our God with all of our mind, right? So that implies a pursuit of knowledge, of truth, which leads to actions. And of course, the blessed man in the book of Psalms is someone who meditates on the law day and night. It's an action using our brain. So we all want to emulate this. Is there anything we can do to make things easier? So for this experiment, there's 3 steps. The first step is I want you to think of an activity or something that gives you a great amount of pleasure or fulfillment, and choose anything. I'm not going to know. I'm not going to find out. Obviously, It sometimes it'll often involve something sexual or basic. It doesn't really matter. Keep thinking, and just until you get to what it's honest. And you're going to write 3 adjectives of what you would use to describe it. Where fun, happy, whatever it is. And then type it out, write it down. I'm not going to see it. This is just for you. Nobody else is going to see it but you. Okay. So the next thing I want you to do is think of your favorite secular songs, whatever they are, and then just write down the style of music that they are, like 3 genres. Or if you only like 1 genre, that's fine. If you only like 50s rock, 70s disco, big band, whatever it is. Okay? And then the last thing I want you to do is to write down songs that have the word Christmas in the title of it. And I know this seems very random, but just bear with me. This is all going to make sense. So like if you can think of like 3 songs off the top of your head or just a couple, I'll give you just a moment to put that together. All right, so we're going to come back to this stuff later, but for the time being, don't worry about it whatsoever. In fact, forget about it. So why is righteousness hard? Well, for one, human beings are inherently rather irrational, right? I mean, it's been proven in studies that even people who go through life-saving organ transplants, who've gone through all these extensive operations, who have been lucky to be pulled off the list, and they get the operation, which is rather involved, and all they have to do is keep taking anti-rejection medication that they stop. And this is not just the people that can't afford it or have bad side effects. Some people just don't do it, and it costs them their life. So our sense of self-preservation is not good, even at the most basic scientific level. And I'm always looking for how our human brain works. What makes us tick? Now, of course, some things are knowable, some things aren't, right? Some patterns are just well beyond our detection. And when speaking is something as complicated as the human brain, it's hard to analyze, but you can find patterns, and I'm just somebody who loves patterns, even in more frivolous activities like movies or stories. I love story theories. There's a story theory called Save the Cat, or there's Dramatica, and it tries to explain why we are psychologically affected by stories, why some movies, some artistic works are more successful than others. I've actually written 3 fictional novels myself, and it's an interesting process when you do it because you're trying to figure out essentially how to manipulate your audience. But even beyond the frivolous, the same thing goes through my spiritual life. You know, rather than take what I consider to be a more ethereal approach, I tend to look at things the best way I know how, which is cause and effect, and kind of reason things out the best I can. God himself implies we are given this ability. Obviously, in Isaiah 1, it's a famous verse. He says, let us reason together. And when he's talking in that verse, he's going to further explain sin and redemption. But that makes sense because if you're like, okay, it does make reasonable sense that if we know there is evil, that there will be an antidote. We know if there's going to be sin, there's going to have to be some sort of redemption plan. We know that we as we are isn't going to work. You can just reason that out. Like, why would you want to keep this system going perpetually with all the suffering there is? There's going to have to be a solution. So even, we could reason this out. Romans 2 says, Gentiles, when they don't have the law, by nature do what the law requires. They are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. And that again implies by their nature, so that implies human nature can lead you to make rational decisions. You can follow them, and they can be correct, especially if you're honestly trying to pursue truth and not your own agenda. If you're really looking at the information given to you, you often can come to the right conclusion. Remember, we are made in the image of God. So even on the most basic level, we have this connection to order. God is order. And if we're made in the image of God, we're made in the image of order to some extent, obviously well short, which explains our irrationality. And it really took this biblical worldview to explain this to people and to establish this kind of human discipline. In order to look for order, you have to believe in order. Well, in order to believe in order, you have to believe in an order maker. Chaos cannot make order. Random chance cannot make determinable patterns. So to believe in cause and effect, you have to, that could become a system, you have to believe in a constant of the universe. So monotheism is the powerful statement the Bible presents that's world shattering. It has changed culture ever since. People want to minimize it, but really just the idea that there's something to observe, something to study, it only really works beyond, not beyond a material universe, but at least a material universe that had a maker behind it, an order to it. It can't just be a material universe from just sheer chaos. And so you can observe cause and effect, which is what I'm getting at. And so we can go back, though, to John, which explains this further, where John 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We all know this, He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that has been created. So obviously the word in here is logos, and it speaks to order. Aristotle popularized the idea of three methods of persuasion, and logos was the reasoned one. And it really comes to the heart of order. So all of this is just an introduction to explain how I end up with a somewhat pragmatic approach to what is a spiritual journey, because some people find getting into cause and effect or trying to rationalize things to be problematic. And I'm not saying there isn't a spiritual component that's well beyond our comprehension. Of course, I believe that. Romans 11, how unsearchable his ways and untraceable, how unsearchable his judgments, and untraceable his ways, referring to God. So there's stuff that goes well beyond my comprehension. What I'm talking about is what is easier for me to understand. I don't tend to like to guess what's human free will and what is God and where that tension is, because the tension exists, but that's beyond what I can understand. But if I know that we are irrational and we know that God is beyond comprehension, well, where does that leave us? We kind of are in this no man's land. But I think through group experience and observation, we can understand human behavior to some extent. And more to that, I think the Bible speaks a lot to think of it this way, a lot to use human cause and effect. I mean, really, God had to limit, in a certain sense, his greatness to our level from the very beginning. Obviously, I don't mean he had to put his greatness on hold, but I mean just to have a conversation with us, he had to decide to put himself into time and space. So he had to give us this simplified version of himself. So when figuring out the best way for us to talk to ourselves, the methods that we can use in encouraging righteousness within ourselves, we can use human terms, we can try to use human reasoning. It's how God speaks to us as well. And I'm going to go into what I believe are the three methods that God uses to kind of limit this beyond our comprehension concepts down to our level. And then we'll see how we can use that same method on ourselves to try to help us through this walk. The three methods I say that God uses is story, sensory, and symbolism. So it's pretty easy to remember. It's 3 S's. Okay? So we're going to start with stories. Now, why exactly does God work with stories? I mean, the Bible could have been written as a scientific document or like a legal document or like a blueprint. It could look like codes of text for a computer program that you just execute. And some sections are, obviously, there's some laws, don't murder, don't covet, but a lot of it is not. And perhaps the reason, at least I'm going to speculate the reason, is due to our own human psyche. Scientific studies have shown that people remember stories up to 22 times facts. And you can even test this on yourself. I have a test that we can do on here. It's a experiment, okay? So the way this works is a person has told you that there is a series of cards. On one side of the cards is letters, and on the other side of the cards are numbers. Okay, so it's like A to Z, 1 through 8, but it's random. The random letters, random numbers. Excuse me. But he has asked you to test a theory he has about this, because he says there's actually a system to these cards. If a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. Okay? So let me see. I have something to share so I can show you a visual if I can do this. Okay, so you have 4 cards in front of you. You have an A, a D, a 4, and a 7. And what you're trying to test out is for every card that has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other side. Okay? If a card has a vowel on one side, it has an even number on the other side. Now, which cards do you have to flip over to test this in the shortest amount of moves? Okay, the obvious one you have to flip over is A, because it's a vowel. So you have to test to see if it's an even number. But you might have thought you had to either turn over D or turn over 4, but you really have to turn over 7. And the reason being is that D, if you flipped it over and it was an even number, it does not matter because it doesn't say that all even numbers have to have vowels on the other side. Okay? And 4 doesn't matter because it didn't say that even numbers have to have vowels on the other side either. It's 7 you have to flip over because if it was a vowel, it would be incorrect. Now, that probably may have just sounded like complete gobbledygook to you. And if it did, don't worry, you're a completely normal person. This test is done at universities. It's done among scholarly type people, and it doesn't usually go very well. But I'm going to give you another test, okay? You're a bouncer at the bar, and you've been told you have to kick out people who are not 21. You have to card them, okay? You see 4 people. 1 you know is not 21. 1 is drinking a martini. 1 is drinking a soda. And 1 is drinking a beverage that you can't tell what it is. You're not sure. Who do you card? You probably have said you card the person drinking the martini and you card the person who you can't tell what the beverage is, right? Well, you're right. But did you know that's the exact same test as the one I just did? The only thing I did was I put it into a narrative that you can understand. So it's very interesting how once you take abstract concepts and then you give it a certain amount of familiarity, it just makes it infinitely easier to understand. So while some people think that the Bible's childish for putting on a story, truthfully, it's a more effective way of communicating information. God is hacking our brains. You'll notice a fair amount of story occurs before the laws, the more explicit laws, are given out. I mean, and it's almost confusing to people. It's like, okay, well, how did they know how to sacrifice? How did they know that murder was wrong? How did they know that this was wrong? But the reason why it's done like that, in my opinion, or at least you can speculate it is that it comes out organically because that's how the human brain works. It makes a lot more sense to understand rules that govern life when you see the chaos that the lack of the rules create. It's almost like an Aesop fable. You hear the story and then you hear the moral of the story. And I understand the Bible goes back and forth with this, but it's interesting. It does start with that pretty long string of story before you get to specific laws. I mean, there's a few mixed in there, but the laws is not until after the narrative. So what does this mean for us? Well, obviously we have to pay attention to the stories that we watch, right, or consume, because as it says in Philippians, we need to focus on what is wonderful, good report, true. We have to be cautious of narratives told from a false point of view. I mean, this doesn't mean that we can't consume things that have sin as part of the narrative, because obviously Bible has sin as part of the narrative. But the point is, a view is a clear-minded of the destructive nature of sin, not an encouragement or excusing of the nature. Even Christ uses sin in his stories. So we can't assume that stories aren't going to have evil in them. We just need to be cautious about stories that contain a warped worldview. The average American will watch 78,000 hours of TV over the course of their life, which is more time than the amount of time the average person will be engaged in eating and sexual activity put together. So it's a lot of time we spend consuming other people's narratives, and a lot of these people, unfortunately, do have very bad agendas. And the truth of the matter is that persuasion works even when you know you're being persuaded. Have you ever noticed the $9.99 price tag? I'm sure you can round it up to $10, but it still affected you. You can't avoid it. The same thing happens. It still seems cheaper. $9.99 is always going to look cheaper to you than 10 in a sense. You're never going to be able to overcome it. The same thing happens with narratives. As soon as you start piling on all the circumstantial reasons behind negative behavior without showing consequences, it's easy to begin to excuse negative behavior. But there's another point, and not just cautionary, but we can use narratives on ourselves. We can find characters in the Bible we specifically relate to, get into the story, and make sure we don't treat the text as a legal document. We don't have to keep it at that kind of arm's length. It is intended at times to be treated more like we treat novels or movies. You see people really anxious to get involved in these fictitious stories, dress up like the characters and really get invested in ways that people kind of keep the Bible at more of a distance than they need to, partly because it's maybe overly reverential of it. I don't want to use that term, but it's like they want to have this emotional distance that it's not asking for. It's asking for you to get invested in the same way. And also be careful about the narrative framework you use in the world. People think the world is coming to an end, and that's their narrative. It's coming to end right now, and then everything gets funneled through that. So every negative story that adds to that narrative is what they'll focus on. Or you can think the world is just made up of victims and winners, and every successful person has a stream of victims, or it's just sheer chaos without any truth. You're going to interpret data through a narrative. I just showed you how just data as data is not great. It was the narrative that you understood. So you're going to do that. So make sure it's a good one. Make sure you're filtering it well. It's like how you have, a camera filter on your phone. You can take a picture of the same thing and it looks a million different ways just because of how you're focusing on different stuff. Now, for a moment, I want you to imagine a church service. Put yourself there. Imagine the seats, the environment, the music's going, the people are talking, the kids are chattering, women gossiping, whatever happens, minister teaching, whatever it is, positive and negative, an honest picture, not a postcard. And think of the first 3 adjectives that come to your mind. Okay, now look at the list of the adjectives you made for an activity. Do any of these words match? If one does, you now have a word that connects your spiritual with your tangible. And what positive adjectives did you write down? Compare them to the other positive adjectives. How similar are they? Can you interchange them? Is there a reason why not? Are there negative adjectives? Can you interchange them? Is there a reason why not? The reason I ask is that people have a tendency to build in their own narrative, to build a wall between their spiritual side and what they enjoy physically. Asking people how they're brought closer to God by having a chocolate cake or a certain sexual experience or skydiving or whatever, and they're often confused, if not flat out offended by the question. But God needs to fit into our narrative, and of course he should be at the head of it. He needs to encompass it all. So the less barriers we make between spiritual and physical, the more likely we are not to compartmentalize, which often yields unrighteous behavior. So this is kind of these lists could be kind of an interesting starting point for a conversation with yourself. So we know that God uses story to reach us, hack our brains. So if this though seems a little bit maybe high level or a little ethereal, the next one is much more tangible, and that is that God uses sensory experiences. So he uses story experience, he uses sensory experience. This is obvious in the Old Testament. It has pages and pages of instructions of dimensions of tabernacles, elaborate sacrificial ritual, and so on. And a commonly held belief is that this is, again, kind of less sophisticated, juvenile, old-fashioned, but it's based on human psychology and it's relevant today. And, in a religious context, God uses every trick he can in a way to reach us. He uses every way he's going to use all of our capacity to reach us. And he still does. It's not something that is restricted to the Old Testament, because we can look at the New Testament and basically what is a sacrificial ceremony instituted by Christ, often called the New Testament Passover or Lord's Supper. We see how he persuades, manipulates, influences, whatever you want to use, the audience through sensory input. All 5 senses are engaged. Okay, we have sight, wine is red, The bread probably was flat. The visuals match the point being presented. Sound, you have pouring of the wine following which was sounds like flowing of water. You have probably the breaking of bread, which was maybe even unleavened bread, it seems likely. So that would have been a cracking sound. And he spoke words, obviously, so he used that. They also sang a hymn, which is one of the most effective forms of persuasion, is music. You have smell. Wine is a very aromatic thing to use. You have taste, because they consumed the wine and the bread. And it's interesting, whether the wine was sweet or dry, or the bread flavorful or bland, it's not stated. So it's something to consider when you conduct the ceremony. What message are you trying to get across? What does that say about you? It's kind of an interesting thing to ask about yourself. Touch, Christ washed the feet. He actually engaged in activity. And of course, they had to physically eat and physically drink. So they were doing something active. So all five senses were engaged. So we need to approach any religious event with the same sort of thought, in my opinion. This is how we work. And so, for example, like Bible study, we obviously sight is covered because you're reading more than likely, but sound, okay, there may be music you can play, you associate with positive feelings. Maybe you can hear it out loud through an audiobook. And of course, there's music. Lots of musical ways to learn scripture. You probably listen to Christian music already. So what is your Christian music like? What does it sound like? Think of your favorite songs. All right, let's go back to that list we made at the beginning of the genres of music you like. Does the sound of the Christian songs match the secular ones? If there's a big gap, maybe you should try to find some within that genre that you enjoy. Maybe you have created a split in your mind that doesn't need to be there. Don't forget, the Bible includes all different types of instruments throughout the Psalms. There's a concept of Sigia notes, which is not completely clear, but it seems to imply abrupt changes or rapidness or passion, something a little bit unorthodox. And you don't want to, if it's something that resonates with you, it's something that resonates with you. You don't necessarily have to think of it as something to overcome. You can think of it as an asset to use in a positive direction. Now, you might think that smell in terms of Bible study seems like a silly thing to worry about, but there's a reason why incense is a part of the sacrificial ritual. So if there's something that smells pleasant, try it. I mean, there's no reason not to try to enhance it. Taste, why not give yourself a piece of chocolate or cheese, or make sure you have a cup of coffee when you study. Psalm 34 says, taste and see the Lord is good. So why don't you fulfill that literally, right? Find a snack that's particularly special and allow you to eat that when you're studying. Maybe only allow it to eat it while you're studying it. Make it a special treat. See if you can create a circular response with that. Another way you could use the technique is maybe there's a specific issue you're dealing with. Find a verse that deals with this issue, some problem you're struggling with or some sin you want to overcome. And then we can use Psalm 1 as our guide when it says that we delight in the law of the Lord, and in the law we meditate day and night. So we want to make this law a delight. So find something you enjoy that you have on a regular basis, and make it an effort for the week. Every time you engage in that, you think of the verse that deals with your particular issue. And pretty soon, every time you do that action, that verse is going to come to your mind. And so you will basically be able to fulfill that verse in a certain sense. And in terms of touch, not to make people feel uncomfortable, but 1 Corinthians talks about withholding sexual activity from meditation and sobering. So there are methods you can use with that, or to incentivize yourself. Or there's other things that you can enjoy that are more of an activity, like going to the gym or whatever it is, that you could use as a reward. Again, you don't have to be embarrassed about the fact that you're a human being. God constantly is dealing with us as a human being. You can deal with yourself and incentivize yourself the way that works for you. And we can take the senses, of course, for the holidays, right? So beyond Bible study, we can go to holidays and do the senses. So for sight, we have the concept of decorating, okay? In Leviticus, they took the fruit of splendid trees, the branches of palm trees, to decorate and create their booths. And sometimes now I've noticed, especially in the Church of God community, that people get fearful of decorations because of connotation with Christmas time. But it's clear that God incorporated decorations into his celebrations. I mean, even if you go back to the first celebration, in a sense, was Passover, where they put blood on a doorpost. Now, that's not a pretty thing, but it was a visual sign from the very beginning that they put on the outside of their house. So we can be overly nervous about whether or not, doing something to commemorate the holidays is going to dive into paganism when God does it. We have the verse in Psalm 84 where he says, "How lovely is your dwelling place," which of course can be taken many ways, but it also shows there's nothing wrong with outwardly showing the beauty of God. And we can think of beautiful religious displays that we've seen that have been very inspiring. And I'm often told, on discussion forums, when I ask people for their ideas on how to decorate for the holidays, that, oh, that's what pagans do, don't be a Martha, whatever it is. But they're neglecting how powerful putting yourself into these celebrations could be, how meaningful you can make it to people. People do all kinds of random practices involving Christmas that aren't even religious. They keep up these traditions, and in a certain sense, it reminds them of certain things. And I'm not saying to do that. I'm just saying that it shows the psychological effectiveness of it. You could create something like that, and even if somebody were to leave the fellowship, they might still continue to do these things, and it might give them some bit of connection left. It's effective, it works. Okay, for sound, let's go back to the list that we made of Christmas songs. Now, could you name as many songs that have a name of a Bible holiday in the title in English? You probably can't. And why is this? It's not because we don't have people that write music, because I'm sure you can name people who write music. I think to some degree it was a cultural choice that we've withdrawn as a community. And let's be honest about Christmas music. It has a reputation of being beautiful music, and it is. I'm not saying that's a problem. It has, but I want to pull back the curtain and talk about it a little bit, because let me list you a list of Christmas songs, and I want you to tell me what these songs have in common besides being associated with Christmas. Deck the Halls, Carol of the Bells, Jingle Bells, O Holy Night, Little Town of Bethlehem, Good King Wenceslas, Joy to the World, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, O Come All Ye Faithful, What Child Is This, Angels We Have Heard on High, O Christmas Tree, Ding Dong Merrily on High. It sounds kind of like a greatest hits of Christmas almost, right? Like of all the classics. The truth is none of these songs were written for Christmas. Says oftentimes the lyrics were tacked on to pre-existing melodies. Sometimes the entire song was not intended for Christmas. So it's not like Christmas just happened to inspire beautiful music. People took music available to them and adapted it. And one can argue this practice goes back to the Bible. We have the example of Psalm 22, 46, 56 through 60, 69, 75, 80, where they all mention settings, and we don't know exactly what it means, but a lot of scholars do speculate that it was written to pre-existing melodies. Some of them maybe even have been secular. I do not know. It's not really that clear. But we do know that the practice continued in that community to the point where even the synagogue songs, which have become a little more trendy in recent years among like the Hebrew roots groups and whatnot, most of those were just taken from their surrounding culture. So we don't need to be thinking that there's this weird chasm that there was some amazing zeitgeist that created this culture. It was a choice. And not to just give a shameless plug, but if you watch my holiday celebration, I do this exact thing because I think it helps people connect with the holiday in a way that they wouldn't, especially people who haven't experienced it before. I take popular songs and I change the words to them. And I certainly would encourage people to try stuff like that, or try writing music, or if you know an artist, encourage them to do it. Because I do think, I mean, everybody knows Christmas music is an incredibly effective element of that holiday. It just is, because it is. Psychologically it is. And so there's no reason for us not to try to take advantage of that as a community as much as we can. In terms of taste, we have the example of Deuteronomy 14, where it says, spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves. So, make sure you do special things around the holidays, make them distinctive. It's probably better if it's something you don't do often, because then you have something to look forward to. It'll give it a higher value in your mind. And that goes with smell, because smell corresponds with food. And an interesting thing about smell, because smell is kind of the weird one to think of religiously, but scientists find that the connection between smell and memory is extremely strong, to the point where they will have done experiments where people just scratched the tip of a crayon, they smelled it, or they smelled a little bit of Play-Doh, and it made them have a more creative thought process of the next test, because it linked them to their childhood when they put less restrictions on the way their brain thought. So, the truth of the matter is you can probably think of a special memory in your mind, and oftentimes it does go with a smell, or the opposite. You will smell something and you'll have this horrific reaction because you associate it with something negative. And in terms of touch, obviously, we want to do physical activities as part of the holidays. Decorating gives you something for that. And then there's like a tradition among the Jews on Passover night to sit around with pillows, and they recline, and it gives them a sense of comfort. And, things like that. What are things that you can do that do affect that sense of touch, or is an action you can do with the holiday? It does have the blowing of the trumpets on trumpets, so that is, or shouting or clapping on that day. Fasting obviously is something that affects us physically, but some of the other holidays, maybe we don't think about that, and I think that's something we need to always be aware of as much as we can. So we're at story, and we've done the senses. So the final thing that God works us with is symbols. So like we can talk about things like the elephant in the room. It's much easier to say that than say the subject matter nobody wants to talk about, right? By making this concept into a symbol, we've cemented it into something, and God does this all the time. Now, people get nervous about this because how do you incorporate symbols in your life without going to idolatry? And I think that's a fair point, but I do think that sometimes people are so paranoid about it that they miss out on opportunities and also end up kind of hypocritical. Like, for example, if you look around your house, it's already full of symbols. It's full of imagery to celebrate your marriage, your job, your hobbies. You might have a painting which invokes memories or emotions, and that's great. But how many of these symbols particularly connect with a biblical principle? And I'm not saying that you have to put up explicitly religious artwork or a Bible verse, or even something like a lamb that would symbolize something like a photo of a lamb or something. I'm saying you can take something that's already in your house and you connect it with something, so that way every time you think of it, it can remind you of something. Like, for example, let's say you have a tendency to get angry more than you would like to be. Most people have a place where they would set their keys at the end of the day. Keys are an easy connection in your mind to locking something, and maybe you need to think that you need to lock up your anger. So you can have that verse in your head, whatever it is, be angry and don't sin, I will lock up my anger. And now every time you interact with that object, you're thinking of that. And I think that's what it's getting at in Deuteronomy when it says, these words I'm giving you today to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in the house, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. It starts with your heart, and then it just starts to move to tangible things. And a lot of people take this literally, and I'm not saying that practice is wrong, but I'm saying you don't need to have a mezuzah on your door to follow this principle. I just gave you an example of a way you can basically do that. I just described it on a key. You know what I mean? Like you can do that mentally. And God used this practice in Genesis when he said, for the rainbow, I've set my bow in the cloud, and it should be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The rainbow wasn't a new thing, at least I don't think so. I think scientifically it would make sense that water always refracted light into a spectrum. But he took something pre-existing, and then he took something pre-existing that he had set into motion that set about an order of the universe to make a point about his promise. We also know God specifically made the stars to be signs and wonders to point to an order to a universe. You can track the stars and you get a sense that there's an order to things because it follows a pattern that you can study. You can come up with time. You can come up with progression. Just looking at the stars, you can come up with a lot of information. So considering God can do that, he can have things that serve multiple purposes. I'm saying that we can do the same thing. We can find ways in our life for things to mean more than they are. And it could be a private thing for us, for us to do. It's not something we have to make a big deal about. Or you can, that's up to you too. But I'm just saying it's a technique that God uses to communicate with us. So I think that it's certainly a technique that we could use on ourselves. So what I would say is, take some time this week to maybe determine something you'd like to work on and think about what it might connect to, what might prompt you to think about that thing, or even if it's a loose connection, it's like a mnemonic device, so you're trying to think of something that it doesn't have no connection. And then think of a verse or research a verse that deals with that specific issue. And then every time you interact with that object, think of that verse and just see if that pattern helps you out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. It's an interesting experiment to try. So that's the three things that I set up. We have story, we have senses, and we have symbols. So I've kind of gone over the way that God deals with us on a human level, at least the way we can understand it. So I'm going to encourage all of us to emulate the example and use some of these hacks to try to get our brain on the path of righteousness. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you for that presentation. Now, any questions or comments anyone would like to make?
Holy mackerel, that was fast. No criticism. Please don't take it as such. So there are vaunted scientists, if you will, that actually look at how adults learn. Mm-hmm. And you would think that the creator of the universe, who has created our bodies, would also exploit, maybe not the right word. Is that my... Wait, I'm going to mute, see if that's me. No, that's someone else. Someone else's microphone is doing that craziness. All right, cool. I don't know who that was, but thank you.
I think it was me, and I don't know why it's doing that. But I'll mute for your question, so it doesn't.
Okay,
do that.
So I went ahead and uploaded 2 copies of some slides that my husband and I have done presentations that look at the scientific study on how human beings learn, as well as connecting it, just like you did, to how Yahweh chooses to teach us. And so in addition to the analogies and the stories and so on and so forth, things that we learn are repetition. How many times does, we've got the Deuteronomy and we've got Leviticus. Because he had to repeat it because it just wasn't sinking in. Also kind of chunking the information, compartmentalizing. We talk about the 613 laws, if you will, but they're not for everybody. They're chunked into, are you a Levite? Are you a woman? Or so they're compartmentalized. Already talked about association and analogy. Also, distinctive information. Is it unusual or humorous? The way that I remember Elijah and the prophets of Baal, when he's taunting them and saying, oh, maybe your God's on the potty. When you actually look at the scripture, that's not what he says. It's much more crude and humorous. But, that's just, that's why it sticks in my head, because it's funny. Personally used information, the whole why the parables are there, the nonverbal communication actually doing, and then the activities of active learning, the whole Last Supper, or whatever you call it. This is my body, this is my blood, I'm setting this example. And it's just amazing. And he set up the whole learning. He set up how we take this stuff in, and this is awesome because you completely I'm just trying to think of the word. You have supported this concept that, you know, if you're sitting in a situation, in a lecture situation, and someone's just talking to you, you only retain about 20%. You know, if you read it, it's about 10%. And as you become more interactive and all these techniques, he's the creator of the universe. He's designed us to learn a certain way. As it becomes more and more about what we say and do with each other, the retention is that much greater. So thank you very much for supporting that concept.
Yeah, you're welcome. It sounds like you're very kind of in the same thinking. That's great.
The item that she posted is in the chat room. It can be downloaded to your local drive.
Okay, awesome. I'll have to check that out.
Oh yeah, just the way that buzz you're getting now comes through on your church services a lot. So
Yeah, I need to figure this out. So.
All right. Well, any other comments, questions, ideas, thoughts? Verbalize.
Hey, Daniel. It's Al Turner. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
Good. Yeah, I was just thinking for a moment about how a lot of the modern churchianity a lot of services that you would go to in the modern church would be composed a lot of entertainment type of thing. And I suppose entertainment really does hold people's attention quite a bit. That's why we have the circus, you know. Maybe you've been to the circus when you were a kid, you know. You were amazed by all the entertainment, but I guess I'm not opposed to entertaining kinds of presentations. I don't think there's nothing inherently wrong with entertaining people as long as the content itself has the right kind of value in it. That's carrying a sound message within it.
Right.
But what I also noticed is that younger people, perhaps younger than you, maybe I'm not sure about this part, but my son-in-law tells me that people do not want to sit and listen for more than 15 to 20 minutes, kind of like a TED Talk arrangement. And if you go beyond that, you start to lose people at that point. What's your understanding of that? Why is it that the people who are in their 60s and 70s, which would be my generation, I'm 62, how is it that we were willing to sit through a longer talk than younger people lose interest very quickly? That can be done about that.
Well, should there be anything done about that? One of the reasons, there's many reasons why I think you have people wanting to absorb information like that. Now, here's the caveat to that too, okay? People say that, but at the same time, we now have an era, or they say, you know, they only 15, 20 minutes, which to some degree is true, but at the same time, you can look at very successful podcasts that are hours upon hours upon hours long. One difference is that a podcast is usually a conversation and not a lecture. It is two people talking. It is not one person talking. But I think the big reason why people have put themselves to 15, 20 minutes is partly television. Television compartmentalizes stories into short chunks. Also, just the amount of information you have means actually time is one of the most precious resources you have. That doesn't mean people act rationally about it. They waste their time all the time, but they are aware of this because, truth be told, you have access to all the information in the world at any given moment. So you are competing with not, you're not competing with the church down the street. You're competing with the entire universe or the world in terms of the person's attention. They could be listening to anything. They could be watching anything at any given moment. And they know that. So you better be good enough to demand that attention. And the truth be told is that the sermon format that was popularized by, I'd have to do more church history to study this, but I'm not sure how it progressed. I don't think it's a new thing. I'll put it this way, that people don't necessarily want to hear a 90-minute sermon. If you look in the Bible, a lot of the time, it seems to be discussionary sort of format situations where they talk to a teacher, but it is like a round table sort of discussion. It's not necessarily this person getting up and lecturing them. I mean, you could read the whole Sermon on the Mount, which is a breathtaking sermon, in 15 minutes. You can read Philip's sermon, which is amazing, in like 11 minutes. So the idea that you can't get across a large amount of content in a short period of time is not necessarily true. I think the other thing too is getting back to what the first person said, is that it's not necessarily that they don't want to absorb a long experience. It's more that you need to feed it in a certain way. It probably would be better if church services, and this is something that I do, instead of doing, I don't do that long of talks in my church service, by the way. I have more of a 15-minute format. But my idea was that you can have as many 15-minute sermons as you want. You just don't want a specific sermon to last 15 minutes, because the truth of the matter is that somebody will go out on YouTube, and they'll watch episode upon episode upon episode of something, or they'll binge watch a show. It's just they kind of need to feel a sense of progression. So it could be possible that if you had somebody or a group that wants to keep the 75 or 90-minute sermon format, whatever it is, that perhaps what the person who does the sermon could do to help the younger people out is compartmentalize their sermon in a different sort of format, so that it kind of leads them through that. But splitting it up is not necessarily the end of the world. I think it's a good idea. I think, it's what I went with, because it's what I was actually comfortable with. And to get to your point about entertaining, I would say I've never been to an entertaining church service in my life, in terms of like what I actually think of as entertaining. I know what you mean in terms of like pageantry and whatnot to some extent, but I've never been to one that I really would, I know people like to use that term, but to me, what I would say is more showy than what people are expecting. And like,
sure, that's what I meant by it, of course.
And I have no problem with, I know you don't either, I have a problem with showy as long as it's content driven, and that tends to be the problem, because oftentimes the more artistic you get, the less conservative / strict about scripture you get, because it's kind of a dichotomy, because you have to be open-minded to be artistic, but you have to be narrow-minded in terms of following a strict standard to be biblical. So you have this tension, and so it's often hard to find an artistically interesting person that is that way. So I understand when you've risen, and they've kind of risen the artistry tangent of the church a little bit, and so there's that tension going on. But yeah, in terms of your
15-minute.
What?
Sorry, go ahead.
What'd you say?
You said you pretty much go with a 15-minute.
In my service, yeah. But see, what I do differently is that, our format is completely different. What we have is we have a prayer from scripture, we have an opening song, we do a reading, because we do the entire Gospels and Acts in a yearly cycle. And that only takes 10 minutes. It surprises people when you tell them that. But to go through all Gospels and Acts in a year, you only have to read 10 minutes a week. And then we have a song, we have a scripture of the week, which is a scripture to kind of memorize, and we have a song that goes with that. And then we have a talk that's like 10, 15 minutes. Then we have what we call the good news segment, where we show kind of a positive development in the world, and we have the scripture that can go with that. And then we have a closing song, and there's another song in there that kind of fits in where it fits the best for the flow. So the whole thing ends up taking about an hour, but you probably hear 40 times more scriptures than you do in a typical megachurch service. It's incredibly condensed, like Power Punch sort of concept.
You have an awesome reader too, who can read steady and fast and enunciate, which is really cool.
Well, you'll notice that too. I mean, you may think it's only 10, 15 minutes, but it's a lot of information. I mean, I've been, I'm so excited now to kind of go off on a different tangent, but like Kanye West's new album, Jesus is King, because I've been waiting forever for a rap artist to join it, because to me it makes perfect sense as a vehicle for messaging, because rap lets you do so much content. The song Follow God, which now has up to like 90 million views, is really a minute-long sermon with like 200 words to it that just spits. And most people can't even grasp it on the first listen. You have to listen to it multiple times, and that's kind of the point. That's how the genre works. I don't think I listen to like hardcore rap. I don't. I have never done it. I just like the concept of the format. So I'm excited about this. But so that speaks to something. It speaks to they're getting more content in less time. So there's ways to deal with this and still keep up your religious content and keep up your Bible content. It's not, I think sometimes people misread the psychological implications of short attention spans, as it were.
Well, in general, you're right. Some of the things that we've been experimenting with, and this is beyond, of course, typical study, is this concept of pechakucha. It's a Japanese thing where you basically get 20 slides and 20 seconds per slide. So it's roughly, I don't know what it works out to in terms of minutes, roughly 7 minutes total for your presentation, but that's all you get. You do your graphics, you do your oh my gosh, maybe it's me. I'm sorry, let me.
Me.
It is me. Or maybe you. Okay, there we go. So in general, we have found that the younger generation, I'm 52, so I'm not quite a boomer. I'm in that generation that's in between that kind of looks at both of you and goes, what the heck? You know, the boomers and the, yeah, whatever. But it's been really frustrating because we've been trying to find a way to communicate. And it seems like this combination, this quick combination of graphics and sticking to your point as quickly as possible has been very effective. It's been frustrating because, yes, the sermon has been the typical vehicle of conveying the concept, but man, after 4 hours, if you haven't made your point, you're just not going to make it, you know? And so I applaud you for trying to stick it down to as short a time period as possible, because make your point. I mean, as you read through the Bible and the scriptures, it's just like, you know, the apostles made their point, they said their piece, and then after that it was the discussion. You know, if you can't make your point in, I don't know, 7 minutes, 15 minutes, I'm not going to put a lasso on it and say, you know, we've got to rein you in. But if you can't get it into someone's mind what you're trying to say in that short period of time, then maybe you don't even know what you're trying to say. And that's an excellent dropping off point. I mean, we've done studies on our off days where we've gone through the, you know, the parasha with 119 Ministries, we've gone through the Torah, the Brit Hashata, all the different stuff. And, you know, just like you said, you spend 5-10 minutes going over those scriptures, and the next thing you know, it's 3 hours later, and you've gone on these different springboards on how those different scriptures can mean all these different things. That's it. I mean, we're not trying to complicate this, and we shouldn't. So that's my piece.
No, I mean, that makes sense. I would say, again, getting back to your point, I don't think that you can't have 75 minutes of talking. It's more of the chunk. I would say trying to split up the chunk would potentially work as well. And I also don't think it's like some unwritten rule, because like I said, there are certainly podcasts and whatnot that last longer. And I've even seen lectures do well. I mean, Jordan Peterson resonates well with the young audience. Obviously, it's a small audience, and
he's a good one.
And he's incredibly intellectual and complicated and long-winded, but he manages to be engaging enough. But that's hard to do. And so, like, I think to some degree, you almost set up people for failure, because it's like you're asking somebody to command somebody's attention for that long, and that is just a difficult thing to do. It's not something not a lot of people are going to have the capability of doing. So why not? And then it also gives more chance for more people in the congregation to participate, which is including them, which is good too. In theory, you could have the same person do it, but it does give other people an option. And telling somebody your task to come up with a 10-minute, this is a quick, maybe you looked at a verse and you just never thought of it that way. That's what you can do in 10 minutes. You can do something very simple. And giving them the luxury of doing that, and it's not like, well, if I only come up and I speak for 10 minutes, people are going to think I'm a lightweight. No, it's actually in the format that you can do that. I think giving that flexibility is nice. I mean, they had the sermonette concept, but I think it's still nice to have even shorter framework to deal with.
Absolutely. And again, I'm not advocating for a certain formulaic approach.
Right.
But, everyone learns in different ways. There are those of us who like to be around the kitchen table. There are those who like to sit amongst, 150, 300 people and get lectured to. That's fine. If that's how you feel you need to grow and learn, I can't argue against that. It's just that's not how I learn. That's not how I communicate to people.
Right. One thing, I don't know if you've seen similar studies, but I've seen a lot of studies that have indicated that when you reward people in a random way, it actually is much more effective. And I would say church services don't experiment with that at all. You almost always know what's going to happen. And I'm not saying things shouldn't be, decent and in order, but there may be room to play with just mixing things up. I mean, just something as simple as, it's strange how this happens, but you end up going to a group and you hear the music or whatever, and then from then on, that's what the music's going to sound like. It's not like 1 week is country week and 1 week is big band week and 1 week is rock week. You just, okay, that's the sound of the group. Okay, that's what it's always going to be like. And it's a little strange. I mean, to some degree, I think people like the comfort, but I think, like I said, psychologically, I've seen a lot of studies that indicate that it's a randomness. And if you look at like apps, video game apps that are trying to addict you, they're always about, the wheel that it spins, and it's like, which prize do I get for getting that level? Or here's a gift, and it's like, oh, what is it going to be? And then people like to watch the unboxing thing. So people do like this idea where it's like, I don't quite know what to expect. It needs to be safe, but it can be a little more varied.
Well, and that's how our Messiah worked too. One
yeah,
minute
no, right,
he's chastising the Pharisees, and the next minute he's turning over tables, and the next minute he's Sermon on the Mount. Hey,
right.
He knew his audience.
no, exactly. God is, by all accounts, pretty random. Like, you wouldn't think, okay, he's going to, first part the Red Sea, and then the next time he's going to do, this. So that, like, the miracles are they're very different. When you read the Bible, it's like every time he intervenes, it's like some different way you weren't expecting. So yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. Hello, can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, coming back to Jesus or apostles or Stephen, and also Levites would talk for the people who were hearing. I wonder, did you do any research on what would be the time that they spent? Like, is it like half an hour, 2 hours, or like 15 minutes?
Your question kind of broke up. You're saying, how long do you think they spent talking to the people at that time? Each time Jesus would stand and finish some teaching, then move on to another place. Right.
Apostles.
I mean, we obviously don't have an account of every single thing that was said in the Sermon on the Mount that we know of. I mean, maybe if that was the whole sermon, then the Sermon on the Mount sermon was not particularly long. I would venture a guess and say he probably didn't go to all that extent of level and then only speak for 10 minutes. I think there probably was more going on. But what you will see often is there does seem to be an interaction with the audience. Somebody standing up and lecturing for lengthy periods of time doesn't appear to be the thing. And people constantly kind of come in and ask a question and then leave. It doesn't seem like it's impertinent for them to interject. So the formality of it is challenging, because also you're talking about somebody doing like man on the street persuasion, It's not the context of a synagogue service, which is more what we're talking about, which was more what's kind of being discussed here in terms of how to form a church service. Obviously, if I'm going to a college or something to try to persuade people to the gospel, you're going to do a constant, back and forth and asking questions and stuff like that. It's more when you get to a service what it is, and to be honest, we don't really have much record of what services looked like. It just doesn't give us the specifics. It does say Paul talked for a very long time because he spoke all the way till midnight. Of course, it doesn't even say from what point it was. Because it could have, depending on how you read it, some people read that as the eve of the Sabbath, some people read that as the beginning of the first day of the week. So it's like, that could be, that, but it seems like a while. But again, we don't know in the context of that if that was more like a Talmudic discussion where they were sitting around a table hashing things out, or if he was lecturing. It's just not all that clear.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, different settings, obviously. Sometimes it was a synagogue, sometimes it's just on a boat, and
Right.
sometimes at the person's home where people would gather. So probably depending on the audience, like we have very short attention span as people. Some of the commercials and movies, Hollywood have dumbed us down to 15 minutes, I think. More than 15 minutes, like you lose focus. But I believe we can train ourselves for a greater attention span. Any thoughts on that?
It's possible. The question is it really necessary, or is it better just to deal with what you're given? And in terms of how much it is from generation to generation, it's hard to say, because as you age, time, you naturally just perceive time differently. Like when you're young, everything seems like it takes a very long amount of time. But when you're older, it seems like time is like on hyper speed. And it's just, when you just ask somebody on the street, how many minutes is it? And then you come back, older people will always average a more time than younger people. Or, I mean, the opposite. Younger people always estimate it was a lot longer than the older people, because older people just, for some reason, it feels like time moves faster. And I'm not sure if that hasn't always been the case. So I'm not sure if this idea of young people having a short attention span is really a new idea. I'm not even sure if technology is messing with our attention span quite as much as people want to say. I think it's changing expectation of presentations and things like that. I think it's more nuanced than just that, because I think, but I don't know. I'm not that much of an expert on it. I have to look more into it. I'm not.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and we do have scriptural example. The Apostle Paul said, "Be all things to all people," and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're undercutting your beliefs. It's just, hey, when he was with the Jews, he was a Jew, and when he was with the non-Jews, he was a non-Jew. You just have to know your audience. If your audience can only handle 15 minutes, then that's what you give them. If your audience can handle 4 hours, or fall out a window at midnight, then hey, that's that's what you do.
Yeah, we do have the biblical example of somebody falling asleep in the sermon and falling. So.
But then on the other hand,
Uh-oh, here we go.
yeah, well, I was just thinking about the fact that, let me do this eyeball to eyeball here. I was just thinking about the fact that we spend time in meditation and we don't experience boredom with that. When you think about David before he was anointed by Samuel, he spent time in the field with the sheep, and he played music, and he was a man that spent untold amount of hours watching the sheep. And his meditations were on things concerning God. So if we're not easily bored with our own meditation because of the substance of spiritual meat that's in it, how much less then should we be bored with someone who goes 50 or 70 minutes? After all, you could be meditating on various statements along the way as the presenter talks. And even now, they still have, of course, in the universities, lectures that go on for a considerable amount of time. I'm very fortunate that in our group of normally 12 to 15 people, we don't have sermons. We have open studies that engage all the people who are present. They all are willingly engaging as it moves along. And so because of the engagement of the various ones who contribute, and iron sharpening iron, we don't experience that kind of thing where I can't wait till this is over. You know what I mean? Because everybody's on the edge of getting ready to contribute. You're riding that fine line, that you're trying to be attentive so that when you do want to say something, you're adding value to the talk. And so what I find is I moderate these talks, and the people many times use up much more of the time than I do as the moderator, which I think is a successful system. If you can get the people more engaged than the moderator, you're doing something right, because they want to be participating. And I just love it. I mean, I find that it never gets old. Let me put it that way. It just never gets old.
I just want to quantify or qualify my next statement that this gentleman does not sign my paychecks, nor do I have any financial connection to him, but he is really good at what he does. It's really far and few between that there are folks that can understand the concept of being a moderator, and they can engage with the group, but at the same time, they understand their responsibility in keeping the peace. And that's really, I think, what Paul was getting at. You know, there's an order to things that, hey, we can come together, let us reason together, but let's do it in an orderly fashion. And I have to say that Al is probably one of a handful that has that skill set. What's that, hon? Oh, that's my husband in the peanut gallery.
I'll
Al,
take care of you later, Maureen.
it's a good thing you're in Michigan. You know, that's a couple states away. Yeah, Paul said, like in Jerry Lewis, you're the disorderly orderly. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, it's a frame of reference. You know, you're like, you know, what is Captain America like? I don't know that reference. It's totally different.
I know that reference. I've seen the disorderly order.
All right, woo, okay. But in general, you know, having the interaction with the groups, that really helps them grow. And that's, again, why I put up those two images, because my husband and I have done these studies and presentations that people learn so much better when they're in an interactive situation. Again, I'm not knocking, I hate to use this word, but corporate situations. You know, if that's what someone needs to feel like they're engaged, I can't knock that. But then there are those of us who, you know, we really need that next level, you know, where, well, like Yeshua, you know, he's with 12, his apostles. It was just, you know, mano a mano. It's just them, he and them. You can't get much more interactive than that. And when you're in a smaller group, it's much more powerful in terms of the conversations. We have found, and again, I'm not knocking this, but as the group grows larger, when you get into 30, 40, 50 people, it's a little, I don't want to say it's unwieldy, because when you've got someone like an Al in the room that can moderate, it's still good. But then some people kind of take a step back and they don't participate as much. And again, I don't know what that sweet spot is. I'm not an expert, but you know, there's a point at which folks still feel like, hey, it's the kitchen table. I can participate. I am learning, I'm absorbing, the word, and I have created relationships not only with the Father and the Son, but the people around this table that are holding me accountable in the walk. But when you start getting larger and larger groups, I'm not saying it's impossible, because again, my husband and I were a part of a larger group, and we had a small little, I don't want to call it a clique, but there were folks like in our age group, we're in our 50s now, but where we kind of held each other accountable. But over time that just kind of fell apart, and that's kind of sad. Whereas now when we're in a smaller group, age doesn't matter. It's no longer a, not that it was an issue before, but it's like, hey, we're all on this walk, and I don't care where you are on the walk, but we're on the walk, and that's it. And that's all that matters. So, Al, did I put in enough good word for you? That check's in the mail, right? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I wish you would just elaborate a little more about that, but.
No, but it kind of gets to what I was saying when the question first came up, because I know, like I said, you have these successful podcasts where people have conversations, and they're not even engaging in the conversation. They're just listening to somebody else have an engaging conversation, but it's engaging enough to listen to for very lengthy periods of time, 3-4 hours sometimes. I also, you'll notice too, successful podcasts out there, Ben Shapiro reaches a younger audience. He's a conservative host. He will talk himself. He doesn't usually have guests, although he does on Sundays, but he splits up his show into bites. He does. And so he'll continually talk, but it's like, okay, we're going to talk about this, and now we're going to talk about this, and now I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about this. And I think that's one reason he does. He also talks really fast, and he also is just a power hose of information. I think a lot of people don't understand that younger people process information very quickly, and you can bore them easily just by not actually just treading water and not really just pumping information, because they're used to just information. So you actually have a better audience in many ways to go deeper than you ever have before. You actually have to do it. And to be honest, and honestly, it helps. It makes you step up your game a little bit in terms of, you come in and it can be inspiring and all that, but people do want something that's a little bit more meaty to a certain extent. It depends on the audience. I mean, it depends on what you're doing. I will say personally that my experiences is I've always have and always will prefer somebody giving a structured, pre-prepared talk to conversations in a religious context, just because spontaneous conversations in religious context to me are not usually well suited, because the people involved are simply not at the level capable of doing that. And that sounds kind of insulting, but the truth is that scripture is so nuanced, so complex, and even really good scholars wouldn't necessarily get into the weeds about a specific passage just spontaneously all that easily either. You're asking an awful lot of people sometimes. And so for me, it often gets kind of rating. So, but I'm not saying I'm supposed it can be done successfully. I just have never witnessed it myself.
And that's a fair assessment. I'm sorry to be.
No, it's okay. Everybody's got their
talking so much.
Just talking about my preferences.
I mean, when you're talking to a congregation of 15, 20, 30 odd people sitting around a kitchen table, there's a multitude of opinions and ages, and Yeshua is our example. I mean, holy mackerel, he could talk to everyone on all these different levels at the same time. It's a skill set that we should all aspire to. But at the same time, I like your idea. Ben Shapiro is a good example, but he compartmentalized. Keep it short, keep it sweet. Here's the topic, barrage them for 5 minutes, and that's it. don't talk for 4 hours over and over and over and over. Like, dude, you've already made your point. No, 5 minutes. And frankly, I'm there too. I either read it, and if the video is 5 minutes or longer, or if I have to read something and it's 5 minutes or long, too long, didn't read, that's it. If you cannot make your point in that short amount of time, why am I even bothering? And that's where we're at.
But I think the reason, and to get at the original point, I think the reason why you do make that choice is not because you yourself can't consume that. It's just you're like, I have a choice. There's probably somebody that's going to give me a more quality thing than what I'm consuming right now. So if you're not at a certain level, then I'm shutting down. I'm going to move on. So it's very hard. I mean, and to be honest, it's a new world in terms of what we have access to. And it's something that everybody in all industries are struggling with. The music industry is struggling with it. Hollywood is struggling with it. The markets are kind of disintegrating as people go into their little cliques in terms of who resonates with them. And it'll be fascinating to see how it shakes down. But you have to realize when you are putting yourself out there, even if you're out in a church, you are competing against everything now, because 50 years ago, they just didn't have the option. If they were bored, all they could do was think about it. Now they're bored and they can literally, they can look at their phone. And even if they don't do it, it's just they know they can. So it's like, and so I don't know what to say. It's like, it's kind of imposing as a speaker, but it's something you just have to be aware of. I mean, you've got to up your game. You are competing on that kind of level. It's just inevitable. I don't know what to tell you.
Well, I mean, how can you compete with blessed are the peacemakers? I mean, if you can't granularize your topic and what you're trying to say in a simple sentence and maybe back it up, with a couple little things, then why are you even trying to engage?
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, like I said, I'm between the two. I'm between boomers and the other millennials. I have no patience for long videos. I mean, Alex Jones, forget it. I have no patience for that. But if on Twitter, if you can in 5 tweets plus links prove your point, you got me. And those are the guys that I like. The ones who link to the Atlantic, and I've got to read 10 pages of a diatribe that is completely ridiculous. I don't have patience for that. And I'm with you. I'm not your age, but I am with you because time is precious. Make your point and be done with it. Convince me. If you can't convince me in 5 minutes, then you're not going to convince me.
Hi, this is Charlene Turner. I just want to get back to your story, senses and symbols. We missed the first half hour because we went offline for some reason. But we have a young family that they're 38 and 40, the parents, and the kids are 5 kids under 7 years of age. And we went to their house for dinner one evening. And I think they incorporate all these things into their Sabbath evening dinner. They have bread that they make every week, and they hold it up, and they sing songs, and they have special dishes out. And so it's all the sensory, all these smells, and the kids, the parents drink wine, the kids drink tea out of beautiful, or apple juice out of beautiful tea glasses. And they read the Torah every week. And I think it just incorporates all the things that you were talking about. Because they're singing these songs because the bread and the dinner and the conversation, symbols, it's all symbolism to them. And I think that really help your children out a lot. And a lot to be learned from them.
Oh yeah, no, that sounds like a really great example of doing exactly that sort of thing. And I would imagine you'll find in groups that are diligent about doing such things is even when people drift, they have a tendency to want to go back to that sort of familiarity. It's like the Pavlovian response. So no, I like a lot of that. I think a lot of that stuff is great. That sounds really good. I grew up with similar type traditions, and I think it's good. I mean, the truth of the matter is you have a 26-hour period in which you decide what to do with, to a certain extent. You know what not to do, but it doesn't say a lot about what to do, because I think it is understanding that people are going to be reached in different ways. It says if the Sabbath, the Sabbath should be a delight. So you have to kind of make sense of that in a thoughtful way, in a respectful way of what it means. But you do have to work at making sure it is a joy, and especially for children, you have to make sure that it is something that they can look forward to, that isn't just, oh no, this is the day we can't watch TV and can't play sports, or whatever rules you come up with, which are fine. It's good to have guidelines to make it distinctive, but whatever it is you come up with, do you have the positive side of the things that are enjoyable? And it's like, yeah, they're kids. They're probably, a 4-year-old's not going to want to read the Bible for 4 hours. So, or if they do want to read the Bible, it's not going to be like a straight up Bible, maybe a pictorial Bible. But even then, I mean, that's a long time. So, and probably not something they'd look forward to, but maybe they would, and then they'd like it. But you need to cut them a little slack. I think sometimes people get way overly pious about it, and they make it really burdensome for their children. And it's like, well, no wonder when the children grow up, they're like, well, this is a burden. Why should we worry about it? And of course, there's a balance, but you have to be careful.
Well, having grown up in the faith, I'm very familiar with the fence being built a mile away from the edge, so to speak. So I hear what you're saying, and this is one of the things that if we ever had children, which we do not, unfortunately, but to teach them, frankly, from sundown on Friday to sundown Saturday, I have the best sleep. I'm not worrying about work, not worrying about anything else. And to convey that concept of freedom and not having to worry, that the Sabbath really and truly is a delight. If you want to watch TV, that's fine. I can't judge that. But, my husband and I make other choices for the Sabbath, and that's how we honor Yahweh. That's our thing, but we're not going to dictate to other people how they do it. Simple as that.
Well, I think that's where you can correctly interpret the verse that's so commonly pulled out about not judging somebody about a Sabbath, is that there is going to be some wiggle room as to what people are going to do. And it's, like I said, there's you can do it and you can tell. And actually, it's really funny, but one of the better statements I read on the Sabbath is the Catholic Church one. I can't remember exactly the wording, but it's like, situations might come up where you have to do things, but you're going to know when you're just making excuses and when you're actually making a diligent effort or something like that, because they want to make people feel like they could do an emergency operation, like, a donkey out of a ditch on the Sabbath.
Exactly.
Obviously that's not necessarily their practice of how they keep Sunday, but I'm just saying on paper, it's true. Like, what you're doing, like, and that's really between you and God, honestly. Like, that's I don't want to get into those sort of details either. But what I can do, like I said, is encourage. It's easier for me to encourage the positive, because that's where less people talk. A lot of people will talk about, well, we make a big deal, let's do X, and we make a big deal just because everybody wants to be more righteous than somebody else. But I think a better display of righteousness, that would be a nicer competition to see, is all the nice things people do on the Sabbath versus what they restrict from themselves on the Sabbath. I would personally much rather that as a cultural problem.
Well, and we're not gonna be standing before Yahweh or the Son and going, and He's not going to say, well, you did absolutely nothing. You didn't cook on the Sabbath. You didn't do this. You didn't walk more than 100 yards. Right. He's going to say, well, how did you treat your brother? Because you guys didn't necessarily agree on how to keep the Sabbath.
Right, of course.
That's the important thing, is how did we treat each other? Right. Not did we have some whatever self-inflicted self-importance? whatever. I'm not going to go into the stuff we've encountered.
And even if it's in sincere belief, that's fine. I just, where it frustrates me is not so much that somebody comes up with sincere belief that's restrictive, because that often is a good thing. It's more that I don't see it balanced with a sincere belief that's a positive. I feel like you got to have that balance. So if you want to say, if you want to come up with the super strict version, I'm sure there's a way to do a super strict version and it still be incredibly enjoyable for yourself and cool,
Right, for him who thinks it's sin, but
Exactly.
you can't you can't judge how people do things. We're all on this walk.
Right.
So.
And I was getting back to like the holiday stuff, is that, the holiday stuff, people get so bent out of shape out of whatever. It's like, you've repurposed Christmas lights. How dare you do whatever. And it's like, I mean, if you have that association, you don't want to do it, cool. But if I just think they're pretty lights and I put them up at Pentecost and it's just pretty looking and I just like it, then I think it's cool. So, it's funny, like, it's just with how many people I feel are adopting these practices, because we're now up to a strong amount of people. It's hard to tell because they're scattered, but it's probably close to 250,000 in America at this point. And yet you're just not seeing what I would like to see culturally happen. Like, I can't easily get decorations for any stuff, and I can get all kinds of whatever, Torah t-shirts, mezuzahs, fringes, whatever. But I mean, I can't get things like that. There's nobody writing songs. It's a little strange to me. It's like they're so paranoid with not doing it the same as the way people do Christmas, not realizing that it's mostly neutral things they're doing. They're just psychologically effective ways of doing something. It's not bad to do it the same because they do it. Because that's the common answer again. It's like, well, why do you want to do what the pagans do? And it's like, well, I do everything the pagans do, really. They sleep, they eat, like, I don't know what to tell you,
Well, to be fair, there are some songs, and I did post in the comments, like Handel's Messiah was not written for Christmas.
Right.
But it was adopted for that purpose. And
right.
Unfortunately, it's a beautiful, beautiful song. And it's the same with, there are other songs, but because...
Joining the World also was not written for Christmas.
Absolutely. And there are so many things that have been hijacked, I think is the right word, to be associated with pagan activities and pagan traditions, that we've basically thrown the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fair, because I get it. There's the scripture about, if my brother is weak and he's got to eat vegetables because he doesn't get the meat that's been sacrificed to idols, even though it's clean meat, because it was sacrificed with idols, they're going to have a problem with it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to eat it. And that's the crux of battling between mercy and not being a stumbling block. But hey, we have choice. We have been given the power of deciding with mercy and creating relationships with each other and God. So very empowering.
I mean, I guess again, that like what my concern is that like, for example, you can ask somebody who has kept Pentecost their entire life, what are two great things that you do on Pentecost to make it special? And a lot of people have absolutely no answer. I mean, I'm not saying you don't. A lot of people don't. And I'm not saying that it's a sin not to have a traditional thing to do. But what I do think is that it's peculiar, because in any other human institution, you would. So it's not like you're separating it and not doing it because you're worried about being pagan, because for other things, you probably have some sort of common thing that you do or look forward to. But you've made a division in your head that didn't need to exist. And I think and one thing I think that's fascinating is in terms of the fruits of this is that it's certainly like with the Worldwide Church of God setting, you had a group of people able to go in and basically say, well, we don't have to worry about the holidays anymore. And a lot of people just didn't care. And I think a lot of that's because why it was just another day to go to church for a lot of people. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't. I mean, I guess because there was just this evaporation. And could you go into a Protestant church and tell them you don't have to keep Christmas anymore? Get that kind of reaction? Absolutely not. Now they have the whole influence of the world behind them, but it is deep rooted. And I think I would like to see a little bit more of that in the way that people deal with the biblical holidays. I would like to see that kind of deep-rooted. This is so personal to me that it's offensive to me that you would even, think about taking this away from me. And I mean, we would approach it correctly, but I don't really see that, and maybe that's just me. I just don't see it, and I don't. And to be frank, I made a concerted effort because I have a new son. He's 3 years old. And I was like, what? I want for him to have this kind of passion and things to look forward to. And I've had to do almost all the legwork myself in terms of coming up with things that would make sense to edify the day because the resources are not there that I can find easily. And I look.
No, and you're totally right. Sometimes it's easier to rely on the default, for lack of a better word to adopt. And the default isn't exactly the right way to approach it. And, I'm not necessarily advocating throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I've used that analogy before. But maybe there is some sort of common ground that isn't necessarily adopting some things that could be interpreted as paganism, because they talked about, hey, I don't want to be a stumbling block, but at the same time, I want to create imagery and symbolism that enforce the day and help it be memorable, whether it's as Shabbat or it's, the high days or, whatever the season may be. And that's the difficulty. Do we adopt, doing the dreidel and the whole Hanukkah and everything else for Hanukkah? There's some symbolism there and things that do align with our beliefs, but there are some things that is embedded that could be interpreted as in paganism. The whole building the Sukkot. Oh man, the symbolism there is amazing. But there are some who are just saying that, well, if we do that we're engaging in paganism and rejecting the whole Messiah. I'm like, wait a minute. You're completely missing the concept of I'm the vine and the branches, whatever. But in the long run, we have a merciful Lord, and he isn't going to be, and I said this before, he isn't going to be, hey, did you do it exactly right? No, he's going to say, how did you treat each other because you had you didn't exactly agree on these twiggy matters. You agreed on the trunk, but you may not have agreed on these twiggy matters. How did you treat each other? And I'm with you. Where can we find these traditions that work for our children or for our family that doesn't look like we're trying to adopt paganism or Judaism or things that hijack the message? I don't know.
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, like I said, I've developed all of this on my own, and eventually, I feel like when I get to a certain level, I'm going to start sharing it to maybe hope that not only it will help others, but it will maybe encourage others to give me their ideas too and whatnot. I plan on doing a YouTube series because I hear a lot of people in the same boat as me. It just doesn't seem like the people that are in the power to kind of be of influence are really dealing with this issue. It's more the people in the seats, not so much the people in charge of the content. So I do see a hunger for it to a certain extent. And exactly what you said, it's like, I don't want to just embrace Judaism. I don't want to, or I also don't want to just do frivolous things that are just silly. You know, I don't want to just throw things willy-nilly just to make it fun. I want things to be, thoughtful. So that's really been my bent on things, and just different and in the way I've approached it. It's I mean, I want it to. I'm not. It's not. Just so you get the idea. I mean, I put the religious side kind of on hold for the purpose of the talk because I'm not in when I'm thinking in this way. I'm not really worried about what God is judging on me one way or the other, because I know that, like you said, there's mercy involved in all of that. I'm more concerned of, just from a practical standpoint, how do I make this something enjoyable for my son on a human level? And the religious side is going to sort itself out because I'm doing this through, a biblical lens. I'm not just doing whatever I want. And God will probably, if I'm trying to be diligent, then God will probably say that I did a good job. But I think there is something to be said for taking the effort to do a good job. I don't know. I'm not saying it's like a competition, you're looking for brownie points or something, but there is something to be said about it, besides the fact that you might ensure your children stay more emotionally invested, which of course is my number one concern.
You were mentioning about perception.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a few years ago, well, actually it's been probably now 10, CGI, this is back when Ron Dart was still around. They were playing music that expressed Christ's birth. Well, they were playing, quote, Christmas music. Oh no! And it went out that they were just, they've gone off the track. They're playing Christmas music.
Right.
But you listen to the words, they're right on.
Mm-hmm.
It's sad. It really is. Someone could, you're trying to convey it.
Right.
Dude, you totally ferreted me out. I mean, that was one of the things to which I was referring. And there were so many people that were turned off because they have like the night before the first day. Well, it's really sundown and it's the first day of the feast. He would play these songs like Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. And so many people were offended because like, oh, that's a Christmas song. Well, wait a minute. If we really and truly believe that our Messiah was born during this time of year, and you really and truly listen to the song, it's not talking about Christmas trees. It's talking about he is with us and he's tabernacling amongst us. So why are you offended? But then, like I said before, we're dealing with, do I eat this meat even though I know it's clean and it's beef, but it was sacrificed to idols? No.
I can understand the conflict there because psychologically you've imprinted it, and so it comes to mind, and you might have images that you don't really want to have to wrestle with and all of that. My point wasn't even that, and then people want to do that, that's fine. My point was more the practice was to take what was in the existing culture and to appropriate it. And we are scared to do that now. I don't know. Jews do it to some extent, but I don't know very many in the COG community that will be like, all right, here's this Taylor Swift song. I'm going to make it about the Festival of Tabernacles. Like, just to do that would seem almost sacrilegious. See, you're laughing. But see, that's exactly what they did. And the question is they may have even did that back in the time of Psalms. It's debatable, but the Psalms I mentioned might have very well been that exact thing. We don't, it's not 100% clear. I can't be dogmatic about it, but there is scholarship that would indicate that's the case. So, but we are scared to do that now. But I think if you think about it, it's engaging. When you engage culture like that, it's like you're saying, no, a beautiful thing. I'm going to spin it around and I'm going to make it a beautiful thing for God. Okay. And I understand now there's issues with copyright and stuff like that to some extent, although less and less now with the internet, it's become very Wild Westy. So it's actually a little bit more acceptable now. But it's just a very different mindset. And it's a mindset that I would like to see a little bit more of in terms of, again, where's the wall? you know, when you have a dance, if you do religious music, do you dance a certain way? When you play secular music, do you dance a certain way? If both ways are acceptable to you in terms of not being provocative, why should you even have a difference? Things like that. That's the cultural stuff I'll see, and I don't know how. I'd like to see less of that. I'd like to see those barriers drop as much as possible. And I'm not saying you can't dance to secular music. I'm just saying it's strange that it's like you put on your religious hat and then you put on your secular hat, and that's where it starts. It's not as I feel like you can get into issues in terms of compartmentalizing your life, but not only that, but you just may not be as engaged. And remember, you know, we want to be the hot, we don't want to be the lukewarm, and you want to try to get yourself up there. It's easier to be lukewarm than it is hot. So in terms of things like that, and that's why, like, honestly, I do that kind of stuff at my events. You know, at Days of Unleavened Bread, I had a song to Dancing Queen by ABBA. At Trumpets, I do a song to Bon Jovi. And I honestly have people that come to my parties that have no religious experience, really. They're like, I mean, in terms of, they don't go to regular stuff. So they don't need to necessarily learn a brand new song. They know the tune. And guess what? Next time they hear that tune in the outside world, my lyrics might come into their head. And now I've just hijacked their brain to think about something that I wanted to think about. And it's that kind of thinking that I would like to see a little bit more of. Let's get a little more aggressive and let's get a little more persuasive with these things.
Yeah, that's
I think I scared everybody.
No, not at all.
Got the thought wheels going.
No, and that was like an excellent, you know, bringing it full circle, man. I got to give you credit, because indeed, that's totally what it is. You know, we're in a spiritual war. You know, so many people, you know, think, oh, I'm dealing with my neighbor who's grouchy. No, I mean, we've got things going on. You talk about hacking your brain for righteousness. There's so much out there that influences not only ourselves, but our children, our families, so on and so forth. Hey, you know, if you can hack something that is quote unquote secular and commandeer it to the point where it works for what you need it to do in order to bring someone to Yahweh or make them mindful of Yahweh, so be it. But the cautionary, as I mentioned before, you know, if this becomes a stumbling block for my brother because, hey, they feel, I'm totally paraphrasing this terribly, but hey, if their weaknesses for vegetables and they have an issue with food sacrificed to idols, even though I know that this food that was sacrificed to idols is clean, I can eat beef for the sake of my brother, I'm not going to do it. But in general, if there's a way that we can work it out, like you said, that can hack the situation, like Paul was saying, be all things to all people, do it. You're not sacrificing who you are. You're not sacrificing your relationship with the Savior. And you're not being deceptive. You're just trying to communicate to someone who this is all that they understand.
Well,
Nothing wrong with that.
It's not even just that. It's, I like the songs. You know, like, it's not even necessary. Yes, I am worried about the audience, but
Okay.
but I'm also worried about myself. I want to enjoy it, you know, and nobody's doing it. So I've got to do what I can. Now I write music, so I've written some stuff too, but it's, you know, it works for me. It makes me enjoy it more. It makes me think about things more. Like the song I wrote to Festival of Trumpets, I wrote it to Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B because it's the theme. So it's a big band song. I love big band, and for some reason there's like almost no Christian big band music. Don't ask me why. It's nice. But anyway, the songs of my version of it, I mean, partly because I wrote the lyrics of it, are just resonate with me, and it just goes through my head on a regular basis. And every time I hear that song, I don't even hear the original anymore. I just hear my version. It's like my song now. And it was something I liked to listen to before. It's something I like to listen to now. And it's not like the old words were bad, but now the new words are nice. And so, and I don't know how many of you participated in like doing the lists, but it's like, again, if there's something that you generally gravitate to and it's separate from what is religiously out there, like try to get this to happen. Like, why not? It's like, why create that tension? For me, so it's like, yes, am I worried about preaching the gospel and trying every method to persuade people? Sure, but I'm also not so foolish as to think I don't have to persuade myself, because of course I do. I mean, it's not like I'm not committed, but it's going to make it more enjoyable to me. I am just a human being, so I'm smart enough to realize I need these psychological tricks on myself as well, of course.
I was listening to a presentation, no, this is probably 10 years ago. And this particular individual says, well, we're going to have a, after the Sabbath, we're going to have, he is risen presentation or a service. And I'm looking at him, and by the way, it's Hal. I'm like, huh? Because it isn't so much that Christ died, it's that he rose again. That makes him capable of doing what he's doing. And it's like, there's nothing there. But as soon as you acknowledge his resurrection, suddenly you're an Easter sunrise. Easter. And it's like, how do you overcome negative connotation to a positive event? That's in my mind, I wrestle.
Well, what does it matter? I mean, I get negative connotation for keeping the dietary laws too. So I don't understand the concern. Like, I mean, I guess I do in a sense. Like, I don't want to be just blatantly offensive to people, but I mean, I can prove scripturally that what I'm doing is sound to me. If you can give me other scriptures that say doing the specific thing I'm doing is wrong, then I guess I could be persuaded. But we can have that conversation, and if we don't agree, then we don't agree, and then we go back to Colossians, and you are violating the Bible. You're saying that how I celebrate it is wrong, and you're just not allowed to do that. So it's not really, in terms of the stumbling block thing, I don't think you can use, that's not really something that I think can be fairly applied if somebody's being honest about the situation, because I mean, I guess, but it's like, I feel like with Colossians, you don't really have, it's like, I don't know if you really should think of that as an option. Like, you've got to be careful with how you are worried about how other people are doing things. And you say, well, I may be worried about people doing things, I'm saying they're not doing these things. Okay, but I'm not demanding you do it. I'm just suggesting, and I gave you my logical reasons why I think it's a good idea to do so.
Okay, you are being, all right, I'm not saying you're venturing into territory of discrepancy or discord, but in general, in our corner of the world, if you will, we don't necessarily all agree on the calendar. We don't necessarily all agree on the specifics of, let's say, the Passover series, if you will.
Of course.
But what we have come to, many of us have come to an understanding that if the scriptures and Torah have convinced us of a certain way, that's what we must do. But if our brother is on a different walk, we give them their space, because, and I used this analogy before, the Lord isn't going to say, you kept the days exactly on the right time. You kept the events exactly the way they were supposed to be. He's going to say, how did you treat each other because you had an agreement on this issue, which, hey, maybe he deliberately, made unclear so that he could see how we would treat each other, because that was the more important thing to learn. So anyway.
No, right, and that's why I'm not concerned with whether or not people are upset because I'm concerned in that I'll hear them out and I'll have a perfectly rational discussion with you and you can bring your scriptures and then you can give me your case and then we can decide. But once we agree to disagree, I'll still fellowship with you or whatever it is. Obviously, you might not be comfortable at my event because of what I do, but it's not going to affect my relationship with you or how converted I think you are or any of those things. I mean, if you're talking about a group in which you're not even celebrating the days at the same time, then I wouldn't think that me doing certain things would necessarily be a stumbling block to somebody. Is kind of my point. People are going to have different paths.
Absolutely. And this is where wisdom and mercy, collide. Do we agree on the same days? Not always. Do we agree on the actual traditions? Not always. Do we agree on what actually happened? Not always. And so having to kind of sort out between, am I being merciful? Am I being overly tolerant to the point of violating scripture? I would rather err on the side of mercy and love, because I'm like, hey, it says, the scripture says, to him who know it is sin and does not, it's sin. I'm going to do what I'm convicted of, but I'm not going to convict or condemn my brother or sister because they don't believe exactly the same way I do, because that's what's important. When we're before our judge, he's not going to say you did it exactly right. He's going to say, how did you treat each other? That's the important thing. So again, going back to your whole hijacking of the mind and whatnot, keeping an open mind, being merciful and being loving, and praying for the ability to discern when things might be hijacked, when things might not be true. That's where you need to be, because there's so much stuff out there that's all about gaslighting us, keeping us in a state of fear and anger and unmercifulness. That's a totally different kingdom that we shouldn't want to be a part of. The kingdom of God is mercy and love and open-mindedness, not tolerance to the point of avoiding God's law, but this is the challenge. Absolutely the challenge. And knowing that the battle is in the spirit and in the mind and not necessarily flesh.
No, I mean, ultimately, I'm consistent. I would give people a lot of freedom on the issue in terms of to do what they want. I was just giving recommendations based on what works in terms of a psychological standpoint. People can do with the information what they want to do with. I guess my sadness of the situation is just I feel like people are often defaulting to something and not willing to branch out and kind of embrace the freedom and the joy of what these things could do. And then just in terms of a lot of the other things I was saying, it's like I think sometimes people don't want to look at themselves in a humanistic way and just kind of do physical, practical things to just kind of enhance things. They're afraid they get into asceticism, which is not really a biblical position. I understand why people get into it, and I can certainly respect somebody who wants to take I can respect anybody if you want to take, want to move to Nome, Alaska and live off the grid and just have a very basic lifestyle because you feel like that puts you closer to God, then by all means, if that works for you, that's great. I was talking more about, the average person and sharing my perspective to see if I could kind of juggle some thoughts in people's heads.
I think we are finished. Thank you.
Thank you.
And appreciate the speaking and the topic. Very good. Now we can disfellowship or say hello, how do you do? And,